Hi, everyone. Guy Powell here. I am with Joe Bergeron, and this is the second half of his presentation. He's written a great book. I just read it. It's fantastic. It's called The Crucifixion of Jesus. A medical doctor examines the death and resurrection of Christ. And we're going to pick up where we left off with his presentation. I know you'll find it interesting. I've been involved with the Shroud now for many years, and I've been amazed at how many new things that I've learned. So here we go.
Um, linen production. Linen production in the first century is known. Pliny the Elder wrote the Natural History, his volume called Natural History in AD 77. Now, Pliny was a voracious student. He read constantly. He lived in Rome and Spain. When he was too tired to read, he had people read to him, and he wrote his Natural History, which is basically a encyclopedia, probably the first encyclopedia. And he wrote about linen manufacture. So we know how linen was manufactured in his time. And what he said was that the hanks of yarn from the fibers would be bleached and then woven into or spun into threads and then woven into cloth. They would be stabilized with starch with weaving and then washed. And so we understand how that was done in that time. Now, the observation of the Shroud of Turin is consistent with that. The fibers in the shroud are Z-spun. What that means is that the fibers from the linen were woven in or spun into a thread in a clockwise manner. Now, that's an important observation because that would indicate that the thread was spun in the northern regions of the Roman Empire, as opposed to what's called S-spun, S as in Sam, which would be spun counterclockwise, and that would be in the eastern provinces, Judea being one, and Africa. So that's really an important observation. That I would point out that saponaria residue was also found on the shroud. Now, saponaria has hemolytic and toxic properties. So hemolytic meaning it would dissolve the red blood cells. And that offers an explanation for why the blood cells or the blood stains on the shroud appear to be red instead of black or dark as you would expect.
One thing,
yes,
sorry, one thing you mentioned in there that the linen was bleached.
yes.
So it didn't seem like, or it doesn't seem like the shroud cloth, it was bleached very white, to be like my shirt, or for example, where, I guess the cotton is really bleached down to get it, so white. So is that true? Was it just bleached to kind of even out the color, or why would they have bleached it but not have made it, let's say, a super white, kind of like my shirt might be?
I can't answer that specifically, and I'm not sure that maybe they didn't have Clorox in those days. I don't know. I don't know that technology. But
Yeah.
what I want to point out in this image, we've looked at it before, but what I want you to see here is that there's a faint kind of plaid background and ultraviolet inspection of the cloth here. So you can see a faint plaid pattern in the background of the cloth, right? And that's consistent with Pliny's description of linen manufacture, as opposed to in the 13th century when linen would be woven together and then dyed after it was completely manufactured. So it was a different process. So similar to like the Holland cloth that was sewn onto the shroud in 1534, it's manufactured differently than the way the shroud was.
And just FYI, we're okay on time, so we can keep on going for as long as you need.
Okay, well, you just turn the switch whenever you need to. Just
yep.
Right. Going on to the cloth characteristics, the cloth measures 437 by 111 centimeters. They say it can vary by 2 centimeters depending on humidity. The thickness is 0.34 millimeters. each thread has 70 to 120 linen fibers. The weave is a herringbone weave. And that's also a very peculiar observation and something to pay attention to. So, I mean, we all have garments that are herringbone weave, but it was an unusual pattern in that time. Moving on to the image of the man is yellow, or more specifically sepia, and the color is only on the top 2 to 3 superficial fibers, each of which were about 10 to 15 micrometers in diameter. The variation in color density of the image was not because it's darker in that spot, but it's because there are more fibers that are colored per unit area. That's called a halftone effect. Am I clear on that? It's a little bit confusing, I think. But it's the number of fibers per unit area that are colored, not that the color itself is darker. And then by direct visualization, as well as extensive chemical testing, spectroscopy, refractive studies, many studies have been applied. There's no evidence of applied pigment, which would be easily visible just grossly on microscopy. But chemically, it's not present. There's no bodily fluids, as I said, aside from the blood stains, which are visibly there, and we can all see them. The blood stains, by the way, contain heme, which is part of hemoglobin, which is the compound in your blood that transports oxygen. So it's definitely blood. There's no question about that. Some people have said, well, they've typed the blood to AB, but I think folks can understand that the shroud is so old and been handled so much that blood typing cannot be considered reliable for that.
Right.
Here's from the bridge of the nose. And so that's kind of a dark area on the image. And you can see that there's discontinuous, not every fiber thread is, and you can see the fibers in the threads, and not every one of them is colored, but just the superficial 2 or 3. And so you can see the coloration here.
Yep.
Now that's a peculiar thing, right? And then here we have the blood. So you can see the separation of the cellular components of the blood that are red, still red. So that would be consistent with saponaria having a preservative sort of effect on there. And then you see the gold colored areas of the thread, which would be consistent with the serum separation from the cellular components of the blood. The chemical test, the blood could be removed by a proteolytic enzyme and show that there was no image beneath it. And I said that before. Whatever form the image did not affect the blood, didn't singe the blood, didn't create a chemical change to the blood, and the blood and the serum stopped it from forming. So if somebody wanted to paint it, they'd have to paint the blood first and then paint the rest of the image. So that'd be counterintuitive, as I said. And so the image formation, there would have been pyrolytic effects. It would burn the blood or do something that would be chemically detected on the cloth as well as on the blood. Aqueous tests were positive for starch, would be a polysaccharide, and consistent with Pliny's description of weaving. Proteins were not detected on the cloth except where there were blood stains. Again, no exudates, no nothing like that. So some folks maybe have thought, well, maybe there was some kind of bacterial contaminant forming the images. No, those things were not present or discernible. There were no pigments, no paints, no human exudates, as I said. And the fire of 1532 created a test to the cloth. So if there were chemical substances on there, applied pigment, something like that, you would see some pyrolytic effects from that, and that's simply not present. It was also doused with water. You can see the water stains. I didn't point them out earlier, but you can see water stains on there. The water stains didn't smudge or smear the image or do anything to it. So those are both tests that give us, inclination or intuition about the nature of the image. Then I want to talk to you about cellulose for a minute. Cellulose is a recurrent cyclohydrocarbon that's bound in a certain way so that we don't digest it. It's fiber. right? But if you expose the cellulose to a high energy mechanism, it will extract a water molecule for maybe like a caramelization reaction or other high energy forms of mechanism that would chemically change the structure of the cellulose fiber. And so if you did that and you extracted a water molecule, then the carbon molecules become what are called free radicals, and they become highly reactive, and they're going to react to whatever's next to it. This will create a structural change in the cellulose that would be detectable by chemical testing, by refractory studies, and by gross visualization under light microscopy. And so we see that here. On the left, you see a fiber that was almost incinerated. You see that, it has signs of being singed. The internal component, medullary component of the fiber is turning dark, and the gross structure of the fiber itself is starting to collapse. So it wouldn't have been long before this fiber was burnt out. But so that's the effect of thermal mechanisms. So people talk about, radiation mechanisms of image formation, that kind of stuff. The first, effect of radiation is thermal energy. So you expose the cloth to thermal energy, it will have findings that are detectable, as opposed to the right side of the cross where you have a cloth, right side of the slide, where you have a image fiber that is structurally intact. The medullary component of the fiber is clear, so the image did not penetrate through the cross, through the fiber, excuse me, and the fiber itself, the cellulose, is intact. So this would indicate that it was not a thermal mechanism of image formation. The characteristics of the fiber density is unchanged in the image or unimaged parts. So if there were anything applied to it, the density would change. Again, human exudates are absent. There's no blood other than what's visible. There's no burn effects on the cloth, which would be evidenced by ultraviolet inspection. Of course, the burn spots we know from the fire, but the main body of the cloth is not burned or didn't go to singe temperature. So, neutron exposure, radiation effects would cause fiber cross-linking and degradation of the architectural structure of the fiber. That's not present except in the singe spots that we saw. The color of the image was removed by a reducing agent called diimide. This suggests a chemically mediated mechanism. Now, if you smear paint on your face and then wrap a napkin around your head and pull it off, it doesn't look like you. It looks like some kind of a smudge, right? That's bigger than your face. The image of the man on the shroud is not by direct contact and transmission. Now, the bloodstains are, but the image of the man is not. It indicates that there was something transmitted from the body that's interacting with the cloth, forming a chemical reaction on the cloth itself that's forming the image. You understand?
Yep.
And part of the testing they did was apply an adhesive tape to the cloth, and when they removed it, they saw what they called ghost fibers. And then I'll show you in just a second, basically that it was a shell sitting on the fibers that they extracted by tape.
So it actually pulled the part of the image off when they did that.
Pulled the image off of those fibers and left the fibers without anything, untouched and unharmed beneath it. So in some, basically, applied pigment, heat, radiation, high energy hypotheses of the image are difficult to support. The findings suggest that the image was formed by a chemical reaction on the discontinuous topmost parts of individual surface fibers. Here you see the ghost fibers. And when Dr. Rogers saw that, it really, such a startling finding that he looked at all the tape that they had applied to the image and saw it on all of them.
Mm.
And so what you have here, you have a crust or a shell that was removed by adhesive tape. That's where the image is. That's a startling finding.
Yeah, that is. And
It left the linen fibers themselves untouched underneath it, and and pulled the image, pulled the colored fibers off of them by this kind of ghost or shell or whatever you want to call it, crust, something like.
Right.
And so on this crust is pigment that adhered to the crust by a chemical reaction. So how did it get there? Rogers proposed the Maillard reaction, which basically is a low energy chemical reaction that's it's everyday reaction, commonly seen. And it's the reaction of a reducing sugar polysaccharide, the starch that Pliny said folks would use, in the presence of an amine or a nitrogen compound, which would be like the effects of decomposition, produce those kind of gases. And pigment is a byproduct. And the period linen was washed with saponaria, then laid flat on a surface to dry. I was in a developing country, and I sent my clothes out to laundry one day, and they came back perfect, pressed and folded and magnificent. But there was sand in the pocket. And then I later saw the laundry. It was the river, and there's a guy by the river ironing stuff.
Yeah.
He was happy. He waved at me.
Yeah.
So,
do you need more sand?
Well, a lot of the world still washes.
Yeah,
clothes.
absolutely.
They wash them in the river and lay them out to dry. And that's what they would have done in that time. And then by evaporation drying, it would cause a residue of whatever had been on the starch that had been on the cloth to settle on the uppermost fibers of the cloth. So, that's consistent with Pliny's description. And so we know that the cloth tests positive for starch. And so it's starting to fit the requirements of the Maillard reaction. And then the decomposing cadaver would emit ammonia compounds or nitrogenous kinds of gases. And those things, it doesn't take long for those things to emit. That's what police dogs can sniff out a body that's been killed and those kind of things. So it doesn't require a lot of decomposition for that to develop. So this is what he postulated, and I think it's the most logically driven explanation that I've seen, that the ammonia compounds interacted with the polysaccharide residue, formed pigment that bound to the crust on the uppermost fibers of the cloth by a Maillard reaction, and created the image that we see. Now, the image of the man, if it were formed by the Maillard reaction, it would indicate that the Shroud of Turin, or whatever you want to believe about the shroud, whatever you want to believe about it, but it would indicate that the cloth had been used for a burial shroud. How else would you reproduce that kind of mechanism if this is the correct mechanism? And I think it's the most logically driven one. And what it would indicate is that the Shroud of Turin was used by a burial cloth, but it was removed from the body before liquid components of decay were present, and estimated 36 to 72 hours. And here's the shroud again, if we want to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting to to think of what some of the mechanisms or the proposed mechanisms are, and whether it's the Maillard reaction or something else. It's pretty fascinating. I guess though, one of the things that in any of these cases, why is this shroud the only one with an image, where there are other shrouds that would have also had the image? So what makes this? I mean, I'm kind of an authenticist. So, but what makes this shroud, this with that image, being from a kind of a standardized reaction, as opposed to other bodies that would have been buried in a shroud, and also, but not having made an image, or not having an image that anybody kept, as long as this cloth was kept.
Well, no other body resurrected.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're going to argue that the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus, there have been other shrouds and remnants of linen found in burial sites, but they're usually fairly well decayed because they decayed along with the remains. So we don't have anything that fits this.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Summary.
Yeah. Because there was a resurrected body, then the further decay didn't take place. So whatever happened after the Maillard reaction then would have potentially destroyed what was there. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
That would be one. Now, just from a scientific point of view, I would point out that a lot of folks, I was talking to a young man and said, well, if you want to pose that there's a high energy mechanism of image formation and stuff, then you have to have premises that the shroud is absolutely the burial cloth of Jesus, that the resurrection absolutely occurred, and that when it occurred, that there was some sort of energy discharge. Well, for just at a basic scientific level, if I can explain the Shroud of Turin without any special assumptions, I mean, if you want to say the shroud is authentic and we have the image and this is how the image formed because it's authentic, that becomes circular reasoning. A lot of folks are going to have trouble with that, from just a logical standpoint. But if you can say, well, there's no miracle required here. This is an everyday chemical reaction. They say it's how the crust on a loaf of bread is brown. I'm not that keen on food science, but Maillard reactions are everyday low energy reactions that we all encounter, whether we know it or not. And if you can explain the image of the man with an everyday low energy, low temperature reaction that doesn't require a miracle, that's highly superior. We talk about Occam's razor or the law of parsimony, or those kind of things, where basically the explanation, the best explanation is the simplest explanation. The explanation that has the fewest number of special assumptions is most likely correct. And so if we can eliminate 2 or 3 miracles out of the explanation and say that it occurred by a natural mechanism and there's no miracle required, that's a highly superior explanation from a scientific point of view.
Right. No, and that makes a lot of sense as well. So
I want to talk, do we have time? I want
one more minute, and then I've got a couple of thoughts for you as well. So
okay. I wanted to talk about where the Shroud of Turin was manufactured, because I've said before that the way that the threads were spun is inconsistent with the way the threads were spun in Judea. Also, the herringbone pattern of weave, based on archaeological finds that we have, are inconsistent with Jerusalem linen. So that's one thing that people have posed, and textile archaeologists have said, no, that the Shroud of Turin can't be from Jerusalem. And based on that, their data and information they have obtained, that's an accurate statement. And so basically, I believe that the Shroud of Turin was manufactured in Rome. And the reason for that is because the Z-spun of the thread would be consistent with the northern provinces in the Roman Empire. The herringbone pattern, here we see Trajan's Market, which is basically a shopping mall near the Circus Maximus. But the floor had a herringbone pattern in it, 1st century. And that's how they constructed their Roman highways. The herringbone pattern was common in the Roman Empire. And I came across one reference to a Roman tomb that had, of the 1st century, that had a cloth that was woven in herringbone. I believe it was in England. And there was a high population proponent of Jewish expatriates living in Rome. And one reference I read, up to 10% of the Roman population, to the point that in Acts chapter 2, when the Jews are gathering at the day of Pentecost, it specifically mentions Jews from Rome and proselytes. So not only Jews from Rome, but they brought proselytes with them to, the Pentecost.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a large Jewish expatriate population in Rome, and I think that that's where there would have been enough Jews that they would have manufactured a cloth for export. Because weaving in the 1st century was all done by hand, and it was every household, even aristocratic households, everybody did weaving because it was so labor intensive. It would take several people a month to make a Roman toga. In the story of the Good Samaritan, when they beat the guy up, they took his clothes because they could sell them because they were expensive. And they gambled for Jesus' clothes. So if we think about cloth in that time, when we read the Gospels, we read them in our time, and we think, well, Joseph just ran to the corner store and bought a burial shroud. No. It was hard to obtain, and Barry Schwartz at Shroud.com, he believes that Joseph had the shroud in his possession before Jesus was crucified. And when you look at some of the translations, allow for that kind of interpretation. Young's literal translation, for example, says that Joseph had bought a burial shroud and that he used that for Jesus. And so you have Jesus, fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah 53:9 that he was killed with criminals, but he was buried with the wealthy. He's buried in an outlandishly wealthy burial cloth. It would have been extremely expensive. Import from Rome, high quality linen that was woven in a way that nobody in Jerusalem had a burial cloth like that. And then a new cut family tomb. So anyway, I mean, I think evidence strongly points to that. I can't prove it per se, but I think that best explains the textile characteristics of
Right. Well, one thing too, you have Joseph of Arimathea. He was wealthy. There's some indication that he also traveled quite a bit. And if he traveled quite a bit, it may have been that, to your point, that he purchased this expensive cloth from his travels, whether it was in Rome or wherever it happened to be, but certainly somewhere where there was a lot of wealth and demand for a high-end kind of cloth, which you would expect to be from Rome, where the Roman capital is. The other thing too, when you look at some of the kind of the homespun weaves and how they were doing it in their homes, the fine, the very dense thread count that's in the shroud is very different than what you see in some kind of these homemade looms that were out there, where the thread count might have been 1/10 of what it is on the shroud. So it had to have been somebody that really knew how to weave something and weave it very professionally, because the straight lines, even though there's a herringbone, there's a very straight line going across and a very straight line going down. And you don't see that in some of the more primitive cloths that were woven.
Right. Yeah, I think it was very expensive. But when people, to me, listening to arguments against the shroud, I think the best one is that there's no burial shroud, that it wasn't manufactured in Jerusalem based on everything they know.
Mm,
So if you want to make an argument against the shroud, I think that's the best one. But
yeah, interesting.
I also think that it's explainable this way, that it was an elite burial shroud that was part of Joseph's end of life planning.
Yeah, yeah.
And that they'd cut the tomb, and that he had gone to extensive measures to provide a very wealthy sort of burial for him and his family, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I've heard Barry, I've spoken to him about that, and it definitely makes a lot of sense. And being a wealthy Jew, you would be prepared for your death. You'd be prepared for a lot of things. And so he had the money to be able to invest ahead of time in a new tomb, and then potentially a very expensive kind of cloth like that. I did have a story for you though before we close, and I've been speaking to Barry quite a few times by phone, and then I had the opportunity about a week and a half ago to actually meet Barry in person. He was speaking at a presentation, and it was really he's such a great speaker.
Yeah.
And but one of the things that he said or that he talked about during the talk was that Dr. Max Fry was the one sampling using tape to pull pollen off of the shroud, and then he'd go and classify the pollen that he found. And he said at one point, Dr. Fry wanted to take a sample right across the face and put this tape right on the face. And John Jackson got into a screaming match with him. He says, whatever you do, don't touch the face with that tape. And when you're talking about the tape actually pulling off potentially some of the outer layers of each of the fibers and each of the fibrils that are in the fibers, that could have left an enormous mark right on the face, which is like the most enigmatic or the most important part of the whole shroud.
Well, now that's different. What he was saying, I think the scenario was that Fry took like some Scotch tape from Walmart or something, and put this, so automatically you have something with a thick gum that you're placing all over the shroud, and you're basically contaminating the cloth. What the Shroud of Turin research project people did, and Dr. Rogers and that group, they had specially formulated tape by 3M that they would use that would not harm the cloth. So they were much more careful.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I didn't mention that.
But still, they saw the ghost fibers, which was a startling observation to Dr. Rogers, to the point that he pulled out all the tapes that they had used and found it on all of them.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, and to that story as well. So in the museum where he was speaking, they actually had the original, what they called the torque applicator. So you had then the tape, this special tape that wouldn't leave a residue, and then you had this torque applicator, so it would only go in a certain distance and apply a certain amount of pressure on it. It was, I think that's, now that I think of it, that's what actually spurred his conversation on that and learning about that.
They were very careful, a very careful scientific group of people, and not everyone that has tampered with the shroud has been careful.
Yeah, that's true. We don't have to go into the restoration in 2002. So yeah, well, anyway, Joe, thank you so much. I think we've gone quite a bit, and I really appreciate all of your time, and it was really interesting. I know I learned a lot. I was looking at your slides over the last 2 days, and then plus your presentation. It really makes a lot of sense, and I think you definitely added to the knowledge and the science base of the whole study of the shroud. So kudos to you for doing that.
Well, like I said, it's largely the work of Ray Rogers that, as I've started to study this, I found his arguments so compelling that it's really difficult to think something else. Dr. Rogers was a chemist at Los Alamos National Laboratories and had an appointment at University of California. And he never heard of the shroud when they approached him to go with the Shroud of Turin research project. And he said, famously, with 20 minutes in the scientific method, I'll prove the shroud is a hoax.
Yep.
But contrary-wise, I think he became the ardent guardian of the accurate scientific information of the Shroud of Turin, and we're really indebted to him for his work, and then the book that Barry helped publish posthumously for him and Roger's wife. Those things are extremely important. I listed them in the references I sent you, along with other things.
Yeah. And I'll post them as well as part of the when we post it online. So with that, Joe, thank you so much. And if you want to reach Joe or get more information, this is the book. It's called The Crucifixion of Jesus. A medical doctor examines the death and resurrection of Christ. Joseph W. Bergeron, MD, and it also has a foreword by Gary Habermas, PhD. So I've read it. It is awesome. Like I said, I learned a lot, and it is really a valuable contribution to the science of the shroud, syndenology, and the knowledge base surrounding anybody that wants to learn more about the shroud.
It's been a pleasure talking with you, Guy. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And with that, for the audience, please stay tuned for other episodes. Make sure you go out to guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. And if you liked this episode, please rate it with 5 stars. Thank you very much.